Beneath the waves of vast oceans, beyond the reach of modern civilization, there are whispers of places that time has forgotten, continents that once thrived with life and mystery, only to vanish beneath the churning waters, leaving behind nothing but questions that echo through the ages. Tonight, we embark on a journey into one of the most captivating enigmas ever proposed by the human imagination, a land that exists at the intersection of scientific inquiry and legendary speculation, a place known to those who seek the unknown as Lemuria. This is not merely a story of a lost land, but rather a voyage through time itself, through the minds of scholars and explorers, through geological epochs and evolutionary mysteries, through the depths of oceans that guard secrets older than recorded history. The tale of Lemuria begins not with ancient manuscripts or crumbling ruins, but with a simple observation made by naturalists in the 19th century, an observation that would spark decades of debate, inspire countless theories, and capture the imagination of generations seeking to understand the hidden chapters of our planet's past. As we stand here today, with all our technology and scientific advancement, the story of Lemuria remains one of the most intriguing puzzles in the annals of lost civilizations, not because of what we know, but because of what we can only imagine. The journey we are about to undertake will carry us across continents separated by vast expanses of water, through tropical forests where unique creatures evolved in isolation, into the minds of Victorian scientists who grappled with questions that challenged everything they understood about the natural world, and finally, into the very depths of the ocean floor, where tectonic plates shift and ancient landmasses tell their stories through layers of rock and sediment. This is a story that touches upon biology, geology, anthropology, and the eternal human desire to solve the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. And as we begin this exploration, we must prepare ourselves to question what we know about the formation of continents, the distribution of life across the globe, and the possibility that beneath the waves lie remnants of worlds we have yet to fully comprehend. Our story truly begins in an era when the study of the natural world was undergoing a profound transformation, a time when scientists were beginning to catalogue and categorize the incredible diversity of life on our planet, and in doing so, they stumbled upon patterns that defied easy explanation. Imagine, if you will, the year 1864, a time when naturalists traveled to distant lands, collecting specimens, sketching creatures never before documented, and sending their findings back to museums and universities where other scholars pored over these treasures with intense fascination. Among these dedicated researchers was a zoologist whose attention became fixated on a peculiar group of primates, creatures known as lemurs, whose very existence posed a riddle that demanded solving. These remarkable animals, with their large reflective eyes and distinctive features, were found primarily on a large island off the southeastern coast of a vast continent, yet remarkably similar creatures, or at least their fossil relatives, had been discovered in lands separated by thousands of miles of ocean. How could this be? How could related species exist in locations so impossibly distant from one another, separated by barriers of water that no lemur could possibly cross? The conventional wisdom of the time suggested that all species had been created in their current locations, yet the evidence before these scientists told a different story entirely, one that hinted at connections between landmasses that no longer existed, at pathways across the globe that had since been swallowed by the sea. The zoologist who contemplated this mystery found himself drawn to a radical conclusion, one that would require imagining the geography of the planet in an entirely different configuration than what maps currently displayed. He proposed that there must have once existed a bridge of land, a vast expanse of terrain that connected these distant shores, allowing the ancestors of lemurs to migrate, to spread across regions that are now divided by impassable oceans. This hypothetical landmass, he reasoned, must have existed in ancient times, serving as a corridor for life to disperse, before ultimately sinking beneath the waves in some catastrophic transformation of the planetary surface. He gave this lost land a name derived from the very creatures whose distribution had inspired his theory, calling it Lemuria, a continent that existed only in scientific hypothesis, yet one that offered an elegant solution to the puzzle that had perplexed him and his colleagues. The proposal was revolutionary because it required accepting that the surface of our world was not static and unchanging, but rather dynamic and capable of dramatic alterations over vast spans of time, an idea that challenged the prevailing geological understanding of the era. Other scientists soon latched onto this concept, expanding and elaborating upon it, suggesting that Lemuria might have been even more extensive than originally proposed, perhaps stretching across vast portions of what we now know as the ocean basin, connecting multiple landmasses, and serving as a cradle for the evolution and dispersal of numerous species beyond just the lemurs that had inspired its naming. As word of this hypothetical continent spread through scientific circles, other researchers began to apply the concept to their own fields of study, finding in Lemuria a convenient explanation for various biogeographical mysteries that had long troubled them. Botanists noted peculiar distributions of plant species, finding related flora in regions that should have been completely isolated from one another, and they wondered if Lemuria might have provided the answer, serving as a bridge not just for animals, but for the dispersal of seeds and vegetation as well. Geologists, meanwhile, were studying the composition of rocks and mineral deposits across different continents, and some began to theorize about how the structure of the ocean floor might conceal evidence of sunken landmasses, though the technology to properly survey these depths would not exist for many decades to come. The theory of Lemuria was particularly attractive because it filled gaps in the fossil record, those frustrating absences where scientists expected to find transitional forms but instead discovered only empty spaces in their carefully constructed timelines of evolution and migration. If Lemuria had existed and then vanished, it would explain why certain evolutionary links appeared to be missing, for those crucial fossils would now rest at the bottom of the ocean, forever beyond the reach of paleontologists and their careful excavations. As the 19th century progressed, the concept of Lemuria evolved from a simple biogeographical hypothesis into something far more elaborate and speculative. Some theorists began to suggest that this lost continent might not have been merely a barren land bridge, but perhaps a place where advanced forms of life had flourished, where ecosystems of incredible complexity had developed, where the story of evolution had unfolded in unique and fascinating ways before the land was reclaimed by the sea. Maps were drawn, though entirely speculative, showing Lemuria as a massive landmass spanning vast areas of what we now recognize as deep ocean, connecting points that current geography places impossibly far apart, and these illustrations captured the imagination of both scientists and the general public, who were fascinated by the notion of an entire lost world lying hidden beneath the waves. The timing of Lemuria's proposal coincided with a period of intense interest in evolutionary theory, when scientists were grappling with how species changed over time, how they spread across the globe, and what mechanisms drove the incredible diversity of life they observed. And in this context, Lemuria provided a useful framework for thinking about these questions, even if the continent itself remained purely hypothetical. What made the theory particularly compelling was its interdisciplinary appeal, drawing together threads from zoology, botany, geology, and paleontology into a unified narrative that attempted to explain multiple mysteries simultaneously. Though, as we shall see, this very breadth would eventually contribute to the theory's transformation from scientific hypothesis into something far more speculative and fantastical. While the concept of Lemuria was capturing imaginations and providing explanations for biological distribution patterns, other scientists were pursuing entirely different lines of inquiry that would eventually revolutionize our understanding of planetary geology, and in the process, render the Lemuria hypothesis unnecessary from a strictly scientific standpoint. In the early decades of the 20th century, a researcher noticed something that others had surely observed but never pursued to its logical conclusion. He saw that the coastlines of continents, when examined on a map, seemed to fit together like pieces of a vast puzzle, as though they had once been joined and had since drifted apart. This observation led him to propose a radical theory, one that suggested the continents themselves were not fixed in place, but rather moved slowly across the surface of the planet, floating atop a layer of denser material, shifting and separating over millions of years in a process he termed continental drift. Initially, this idea was met with considerable skepticism from the scientific establishment, who could not conceive of a mechanism that would allow massive landmasses to plow through the solid crust of the planet. Yet the evidence he presented was compelling, showing not just the matching coastlines, but also similar rock formations, identical fossil assemblages, and matching geological structures on opposite sides of vast oceans, suggesting these regions had once been intimately connected. For decades, the theory of continental drift remained controversial, accepted by some researchers, but rejected by many others who found it too fantastical to credit. But gradually, as more evidence accumulated and as new technologies allowed scientists to study the ocean floor in unprecedented detail, the theory gained acceptance and evolved into what we now know as plate tectonics. This revolutionary understanding revealed that the Earth's surface is divided into massive plates that float atop a semi-molten layer, constantly moving, colliding, separating, and sliding past one another in an endless dance that has been reshaping the face of our planet for billions of years. With this new framework in place, many of the mysteries that Lemuria had been proposed to solve could now be explained in a different way, not by sunken continents, but by continents that had once been joined together in different configurations, allowing species to migrate across land bridges that existed not because of rising and falling landmasses, but because of the fundamental motion of the continental plates themselves. The fossil distributions that had puzzled earlier naturalists could now be understood as evidence that the southern continents had once been united in a supercontinent, before slowly breaking apart and drifting to their current positions, carrying their distinctive flora and fauna with them, evolving in isolation once separated, but retaining evidence of their shared origin. This explanation eliminated the need for a sunken Lemuria in scientific discourse, though the legacy of the hypothesis would continue in other, more speculative realms, as we shall discover as our journey continues. Just as plate tectonics was providing scientific explanations for the biogeographical puzzles that had inspired the Lemuria hypothesis, the concept of this lost continent was undergoing a remarkable transformation in circles far removed from academic geology departments and natural history museums. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a surge of interest in esoteric knowledge, ancient wisdom, and the possibility of civilizations that had achieved heights of advancement far beyond what conventional history acknowledged. And in this fertile ground of speculation and mysticism, Lemuria found new life as something far more than a simple land bridge for migrating animals. Writers and philosophers began to elaborate on the concept, suggesting that Lemuria had not merely been a geographical feature, but rather the home of an advanced civilization, beings of great wisdom and capability who had developed sophisticated cultures, technologies, and spiritual understandings long before recorded history began. These reinterpretations bore little resemblance to the original scientific hypothesis, instead weaving Lemuria into grand narratives about the spiritual evolution of humanity, proposing that the Lemurians had been a distinct stage in human development, beings who possessed abilities and knowledge that modern humans have since lost. According to these speculative accounts, Lemuria had been a paradise, a place of harmony and enlightenment, where the inhabitants lived in perfect balance with the natural world, possessing psychic abilities, advanced healing techniques, and a profound understanding of the universe's fundamental forces. The civilization was said to have flourished for countless millennia, before meeting its doom in a catastrophe of planetary proportions, with the entire continent sinking beneath the waves in a cataclysm that erased almost all evidence of its existence, leaving only scattered survivors who carried fragments of Lemurian wisdom to distant shores, where it supposedly influenced the development of later cultures. These narratives often placed Lemuria in a temporal sequence with other lost civilizations that captured the popular imagination, suggesting a succession of advanced societies rising and falling throughout prehistory, each contributing to humanity's spiritual and material development, each leaving cryptic clues in the form of mysterious artifacts, architectural wonders, and encoded knowledge preserved in symbols and myths. The transformation of Lemuria from scientific hypothesis to mystical legend reflects a fascinating aspect of human nature, our desire to believe that we are not the first to reach great heights of civilization, that others came before us who perhaps understood truths we have forgotten, that beneath the waves or buried beneath desert sands lie answers to questions about our origins and our potential that mainstream science has yet to acknowledge. Maps of mystical Lemuria showed it spanning vast regions of ocean, sometimes depicted as encompassing nearly the entire area of a major ocean basin, dotted with great cities, magnificent temples, and centers of learning where ancient wisdom was cultivated and preserved. These speculative accounts often credited Lemurians with various accomplishments, from influencing the development of pyramid-building techniques to preserving knowledge that would later emerge in various philosophical traditions, though none of these claims could be supported with archaeological or historical evidence, existing instead in the realm of belief and imagination. To understand what truly lies beneath the vast expanses of ocean where Lemuria was once imagined to exist, we must journey into the deep, into regions that remained almost completely unknown to humanity until recent decades, when technology finally allowed us to map and explore the ocean floor with sufficient detail to understand its true nature. The development of sonar and other remote sensing technologies during the middle decades of the 20th century revolutionized our understanding of the ocean basins, revealing not a flat, featureless plain as some had imagined, but rather a complex landscape of underwater mountains, deep trenches, vast plains of sediment, and dramatic ridges where new crust is constantly being formed as molten material rises from the Earth's interior. These surveys revealed that the ocean floor is relatively young in geological terms, constantly being created at spreading ridges and destroyed at subduction zones where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, returning to the molten mantle from which it came. This perpetual recycling means that the ocean floor preserves no record of ancient continents that might have existed hundreds of millions of years ago, for any such evidence has long since been subducted and melted, erased from the geological record by the very processes that keep our planet geologically active. What scientists did discover were underwater plateaus and ridges, some of which had clearly once been above sea level, but these features could be explained by volcanic activity, by the movement of tectonic plates over hotspots in the mantle that created chains of volcanic islands, and by the gradual subsidence of oceanic crust as it ages and becomes denser, sinking lower into the mantle over millions of years. Some of these underwater features sparked brief excitement among those hopping to find evidence of sunken continents, but detailed study revealed their volcanic origins and their relatively recent formation, nothing that could support the existence of a vast inhabited landmass in the time periods being discussed. The composition of the oceanic crust itself told a story incompatible with the Lemuria hypothesis, for it consisted primarily of basalt, a volcanic rock that forms from magma cooling at mid-ocean ridges, quite different from the continental crust, composed largely of granite and other rocks that make up the continents we know today. Continental crust is less dense than oceanic crust, which is why continents rise above sea level while ocean basins sink below it, and this fundamental difference in composition and density means that true continental landmasses cannot simply sink beneath the waves as Lemuria was supposed to have done, for the laws of physics and geology do not permit such a transformation. What can happen and what has happened throughout Earth's history is that sea levels rise and fall, sometimes dramatically, flooding low-lying continental margins and creating shallow seas over what had been dry land, then retreating to expose those areas once again. But these transgressions and regressions of the sea affect only the edges of continents, not vast ocean basins where Lemuria was placed by those who believed in its existence. Modern oceanographic research has mapped virtually every square mile of the ocean floor, using satellites that measure subtle variations in the height of the sea surface that reflect the gravitational pull of underwater features, and these comprehensive surveys have revealed no evidence of sunken continents in the locations where Lemuria was proposed to have existed, only the expected features of normal oceanic crust, volcanic seamounts, and the products of plate tectonic processes that we now understand so well. With the advent of plate tectonics and modern biogeography, scientists were able to revisit the very mysteries that had inspired the Lemuria hypothesis in the first place, and they found that the distribution of lemurs and other organisms could be explained far more satisfactorily by understanding the true history of continental movements and the various mechanisms by which species disperse across barriers that initially seem impassable. The peculiar distribution of lemurs and related primates, it turns out, reflects the ancient connections between landmasses that were once united in the supercontinent that gradually broke apart, with different fragments carrying their biological cargo to various locations around the globe, where populations evolved in isolation, developing the unique characteristics we observe today. Lemurs themselves likely reached their island home through a combination of ancient land connections that existed when sea levels were lower and the geography was different, followed by millions of years of evolution in isolation, which produced the remarkable diversity of forms we see today, each adapted to specific ecological niches on their island. The broader pattern of related species found in widely separated locations reflects not sunken continents, but rather the breakup of ancient supercontinents and the subsequent drift of the fragments, a process that occurred over hundreds of millions of years and that has left its signature in the distribution of fossils, living species, and even the matching patterns of rock formations and geological structures. Modern genetics has added another powerful tool for understanding these patterns, allowing scientists to compare the DNA of related species and construct family trees that show when different lineages separated from one another, and these molecular clocks generally confirm the timelines suggested by plate tectonics and the fossil record, showing that major separations of species groups correspond to the times when continents split apart and began their long drift to current positions. Additionally, researchers have come to appreciate that seemingly impossible barriers can sometimes be crossed by species in ways that seem unlikely, but that, over millions of years, become virtually certain to occur at least occasionally. Birds can carry seeds across vast distances, sometimes transporting in their digestive systems and deposited thousands of miles from their origin, and over geological time spans, such rare events can establish new populations in distant locations. Small animals can survive on floating rafts of vegetation torn from coastlines during storms, drifting on ocean currents for weeks until deposited on distant shores, and while any individual instance of such a crossing might be extremely improbable, multiply that tiny probability by millions of years and countless opportunities, and what seems impossible becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Island biogeography has revealed patterns of colonization and extinction that explain much about the peculiar distributions of species, showing how organisms reach isolated locations through various means, then undergo rapid evolution in their new homes, sometimes producing forms quite different from their ancestors, yet retaining enough similarity to reveal their origins. These insights have rendered unnecessary the hypothesis of sunken continents serving as highways for migration, replacing it with a more nuanced and ultimately more satisfying understanding of how life disperses across our dynamic planet, taking advantage of changing sea levels, shifting climate patterns, occasional long-distance dispersal events, and the fundamental movement of the continents themselves. To fully appreciate why the scientific community no longer needs the Lemuria hypothesis, we must venture even further back in time, into the almost incomprehensible depths of geological history, where continents have not merely drifted apart, but have repeatedly assembled into supercontinents, broken apart, and reassembled in different configurations in a cycle that has repeated throughout the billions of years of Earth's history. The most recent supercontinent, which existed approximately 200 million years ago, brought together virtually all of the planet's landmasses into a single vast continent surrounded by a global ocean. And when this supercontinent began to break apart, it set in motion the continental movements that have continued to the present day, gradually opening ocean basins, separating landmasses, and creating the familiar geography we see on modern maps. Before this most recent supercontinent, there were others, assembled through the collision of smaller continental fragments, held together for millions of years, then torn apart by the same tectonic forces that had brought them together, in a cycle driven by the convection of the Earth's mantle, the heat engine deep beneath the surface that powers plate tectonics and ensures that our planet's surface remains dynamic and ever-changing. These cycles of supercontinent formation and breakup have profound implications for life on Earth, for when continents are joined, species can migrate freely across vast areas, mixing and competing and evolving in response to one another, but when continents separate, populations become isolated, evolving independently, sometimes developing into forms so different from their ancestors that their relationship becomes difficult to recognize without careful study of fossils and genetic material. The fossil record preserves evidence of these ancient connections, showing us that animals we now associate with specific continents once roamed freely across landmasses now separated by thousands of miles of ocean, and these fossils tell a story not of sunken continents, but of a dynamic Earth whose continents have danced across the surface in patterns that seem almost choreographed, yet are driven by the blind forces of physics and geology operating over incomprehensible spans of time. The study of ancient climates adds another layer to this story, revealing that the position of continents affects global weather patterns, ocean currents, and the distribution of environments from tropical forests to polar ice caps, and these changing conditions in turn influence the evolution and distribution of species, creating complex feedback loops between geology, climate, and biology. Understanding these deep-time processes, these cycles that operate over hundreds of millions of years, gives us a framework for interpreting the biological and geological puzzles that once seemed to require extraordinary explanations like sunken continents, showing instead that the ordinary operations of plate tectonics, evolution, and geological time are sufficient to explain the patterns we observe. Though calling these processes ordinary hardly does justice to their grandeur and the remarkable story they tell about our planet's history. Having explored the scientific reality of continental drift, ocean floor geology, and the true explanations for the biogeographical mysteries that inspired the Lemuria hypothesis, we must now turn our attention to a different kind of question, one that asks not whether Lemuria existed, but why the idea of such a lost continent continues to captivate the imagination despite the lack of supporting evidence and the availability of more prosaic explanations. There is something deeply appealing about the concept of lost civilizations, vanished lands that once flourished with life and culture, but that now lie hidden beneath the waves or buried beneath desert sands, accessible only through speculation, through the piecing together of scattered clues, through the hope that somewhere, somehow, evidence of these forgotten worlds might yet be discovered. This appeal seems to touch something fundamental in human psychology, a desire to believe that we are not the first to achieve greatness, that others came before us who perhaps solved problems we still struggle with, who understood truths we have yet to rediscover, who left behind mysteries for us to unravel if only we are clever enough and determined enough in our searching. Lost lands like Lemuria serve as blank canvases onto which we can project our hopes, our fears, our visions of what an ideal society might look like, and are speculations about what humanity is capable of achieving if given enough time and the right circumstances. They exist in that tantalizing space between the known and the unknown, close enough to established history and geography to seem plausible, yet distant enough in time and space to be essentially unfalsifiable. For how can one definitively prove that something did not exist when its proposed location is now covered by miles of ocean water? The transformation of Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis, intended to explain biological distributions, into a mystical lost civilization, reflects this psychological appeal, as the concept was adapted and elaborated by those more interested in spiritual and philosophical questions than in the technical details of biogeography and geology. For those attracted to alternative theories of human history, Lemuria became part of a larger narrative about ancient wisdom, suggesting that modern civilization is not the pinnacle of human achievement, but rather a rediscovery of knowledge that was once widely understood but has been lost through cataclysm, through the passage of time, through the gradual forgetting that occurs when civilizations fall and their learning is scattered. This narrative provides a sense of connection to a deeper past, a feeling that beneath the surface of official history lies a more profound story waiting to be told, and for many, this sense of hidden knowledge and secret history holds a powerful attraction that academic explanations, however well supported by evidence, somehow fail to provide. The persistence of belief in Lemuria and similar lost lands also reflects a certain romantic skepticism toward established authority, a feeling that mainstream science and academia might be overlooking important evidence or dismissing ideas prematurely because they challenge conventional thinking. And while healthy skepticism is certainly valuable in scientific inquiry, it can also lead to the embrace of ideas that lack evidential support simply because they are positioned as alternatives to mainstream thinking. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, various individuals and groups have claimed to have found evidence supporting the existence of Lemuria or similar lost continents, and examining these claims provides insight into how easy it is to misinterpret geological features, underwater formations, or archaeological artifacts when one approaches the evidence with preconceived conclusions already firmly in mind. Underwater photographers and explorers have sometimes encountered unusual formations on the ocean floor, structures that at first glance might appear to be ruins of ancient buildings, walls, roads, or other constructions, and these discoveries have occasionally been promoted as potential evidence of sunken civilizations, capturing media attention and sparking public interest before more careful examination reveals their natural origins. In virtually all cases where geologists and oceanographers have studied these formations in detail, they have been able to demonstrate that the features are products of natural processes, rock formations shaped by erosion, volcanic activity, or sedimentation, their regular appearance sometimes giving them an artificial quality, but nonetheless entirely explicable without invoking human construction or sunken continents. The ocean floor is littered with volcanic seamounts, some of which have flat tops where erosion occurred when they briefly rose above sea level before subsiding as the oceanic crust cooled and sank, and these features, called geos, can present unusual appearances that might seem mysterious to those unfamiliar with their geological origins. Similarly, certain rock formations can exhibit columnar jointing, a natural fracture pattern that creates remarkably regular rectangular blocks that might, to an enthusiastic observer, resemble worked stone or architectural elements, but that form spontaneously when volcanic rock cools and contracts. Some claims of evidence for Lemuria have focused on specific artifacts or texts that supposedly preserve information about the lost continent, though careful examination of these materials typically reveals them to be either misinterpretations of authentic historical sources, which make no actual reference to Lemuria, or outright fabrications created by individuals with various motivations. From genuine belief in their cause to more mercenary interests in promoting their theories for financial gain or public attention. The methods used to date various underwater features have sometimes been challenged by those promoting lost continent theories, who argue that certain formations are much older than mainstream science acknowledges, but these challenges typically rest on misunderstandings of dating techniques or selective citation of evidence, ignoring the broader context that clearly establishes the true age and origin of the features in question. It is worth noting that genuine archaeology and oceanography are constantly making fascinating discoveries, uncovering ancient settlements submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, finding evidence of how ancient peoples adapted to changing coastlines, and revealing the true complexity of human history in ways that need no embellishment or appeal to lost continents to be utterly captivating. These real discoveries show us drowned river valleys where humans once lived, ancient shorelines now far offshore that preserve artifacts and remains of settlements, and evidence of how dramatically sea levels have changed over relatively recent geological history, creating and destroying habitats, opening and closing migration routes, and profoundly affecting the story of human civilization. To understand the genuine mysteries of drowned lands and changing coastlines, we must explore the dramatic effects of ice ages on global sea levels, for these climatic cycles have repeatedly transformed the geography of our planet's coastlines in ways that have profound implications for understanding both human history and biological distributions. During the peak of the most recent ice age, which reached its maximum extent approximately 20,000 years ago, vast quantities of water were locked up in continental ice sheets that covered large portions of the northern hemisphere, and this sequestration of water in frozen form caused global sea levels to drop by more than 300 feet compared to current levels, exposing vast areas of continental shelf that today lie beneath shallow seas. This dramatic lowering of the oceans created land connections that do not exist today, most famously the land bridge that connected the continents across what is now a strait, allowing the migration of both animals and humans between landmasses that are now separated. But there were many other areas where islands became connected to nearby continents, where shallow seas became dry land, and where the geography familiar to ancient peoples was radically different from what we see on modern maps. As the ice age ended and global temperatures rose, these massive ice sheets began to melt, and the resulting water flowed back into the oceans, causing sea levels to rise relatively rapidly in geological terms, flooding low-lying areas, drowning river valleys, and creating the coastlines we know today, a process that was largely complete by around 6,000 years ago, though sea levels have continued to rise slowly since then and are now accelerating due to ongoing climate change. This history of changing sea levels means that all around the world, there are areas of continental shelf that were once above water, where ancient peoples lived, hunted, gathered, and created settlements, and many of these archaeological sites are now submerged, their evidence hidden beneath the waves, discoverable only through sophisticated underwater survey techniques and careful excavation in challenging conditions. The study of these submerged landscapes is a legitimate and fascinating field of research, revealing how humans adapted to rapidly changing coastlines, how they exploited resources in environments very different from those that exist today, and how rising seas forced migration and cultural change as prime coastal territories were progressively inundated. These genuine drowned lands, however, are quite different from the imagined Lemuria, for they represent shallow continental shelf areas that were exposed during periods of low sea level, not vast continents that somehow sank into the deep ocean, and their submergence is explained by well-understood processes of glaciation and deglaciation, not by mysterious catastrophes or geological processes unknown to modern science. The timing of these sea level changes is also important for understanding claims about lost civilizations, for the major flooding occurred during the transition from the Ice Age to the current interglacial period. Well before the time when any complex civilization could have developed the characteristics often attributed to places like Lemuria, though certainly human populations were affected by these changes, and their stories might have preserved memories of the flooding in the form of myths and legends that speak of ancient floods and lost lands. While continents do not sink beneath the ocean as the Lemuria hypothesis supposed, there are indeed places where significant amounts of land can disappear beneath the waves, and understanding these real phenomena provides important context for evaluating claims about lost lands and helps us distinguish between geological processes that actually occur and those that violate our understanding of how the Earth works. Volcanic islands, born from the eruption of molten rock from beneath the ocean floor, can grow to substantial sizes, sometimes supporting significant ecosystems and even human populations, but these islands are subject to forces that can cause them to vanish in ways that seem dramatic to human observers, though the processes involved are well understood and quite different from the sinking of continental landmasses. The creation of volcanic islands typically occurs in two settings, either at mid-ocean ridges where tectonic plates are pulling apart and magma rises to fill the gap, or above hotspots where plumes of particularly hot mantle material rise from deep within the Earth, melting through the overlying crust and creating volcanoes that build up from the ocean floor until they emerge above the waves. These islands can grow quite large through repeated eruptions, with some becoming substantial landmasses that develop diverse ecosystems, but their fate is ultimately determined by the same tectonic processes that created them, for as the oceanic crust on which they sit ages and cools, it becomes denser and sinks lower into the mantle, a process called thermal subsidence that gradually causes volcanic islands to submerge beneath the waves over millions of years. This subsidence is a slow process, occurring over geological time scales, but it ensures that volcanic islands have finite lifespans at the surface, eventually becoming seamounts as they sink below sea level, and if conditions are right, they may acquire caps of coral reef that grow upward to maintain their position near the surface even as the volcanic base continues to sink, creating atolls, those ring-shaped coral islands that mark the locations of vanished volcanic peaks. More dramatically, some volcanic islands can partially or completely collapse in catastrophic events when the structure of the volcano becomes unstable, leading to massive landslides that send enormous volumes of rock plunging into the ocean, generating tsunamis and leaving behind only fragments of the original island. There are documented cases of such collapses throughout history, with some occurring during human habitation of the affected islands, creating lasting memories and legends about lands that disappeared, and these real events provide a plausible basis for some traditional stories about vanishing lands, even if the details have been embellished or altered in the retelling over generations. The most dramatic example in recorded history occurred in the late 17th century, when a massive volcanic eruption literally destroyed most of an island, blowing it apart in an explosion that was heard thousands of miles away, generating a tsunami that caused devastation around the surrounding sea, and changing the regional geography so dramatically that maps had to be completely redrawn. Such events, while spectacular and certainly memorable to those who witnessed them or heard reports of them, involve processes operating on scales of individual islands, not continent-sized landmasses, and they occur through mechanisms, volcanic eruption and structural collapse, that are well understood and that leave clear geological signatures in the form of debris fields, tsunami deposits, and the remnants of the destroyed volcanic edifice. These real vanishing lands, then, are quite different from Lemuria as imagined, both in their scale, involving islands rather than continents, and in the mechanisms of their disappearance, but they demonstrate that dramatic geological changes can and do occur, that lands can indeed vanish beneath the waves, and that human memory can preserve accounts of such events, even if the details become distorted or exaggerated over time. The persistence of stories about great floods and vanished lands in the traditional narratives of many cultures around the world has often been cited as evidence supporting the existence of lost continents like Lemuria, with proponents arguing that these widespread stories must be based on actual historical events, memories of catastrophes that destroyed advanced civilizations and that have been preserved in oral tradition despite the passage of millennia. A closer examination of these stories, and of what we know about human memory, oral tradition, and the processes by which myths develop, reveals a more complex and ultimately more interesting picture than simple interpretations suggesting direct historical memory of specific events. Many cultures do indeed preserve stories of catastrophic floods, and this widespread occurrence has led some to propose that these stories all refer to a single global event, perhaps the flooding of lands like Lemuria, but analysis of the specific details of these various flood stories reveals that they differ significantly from one another in their particulars, suggesting that they derive from different experiences and have been shaped by different cultural contexts rather than all referring to a single shared historical event. Flood stories are particularly common for a very understandable reason. Throughout human history, people have tended to settle near water sources, along rivers, on coastal plains, and near lakes, because these locations provide essential resources including drinking water, transportation routes, fertile soil for agriculture, and access to aquatic food sources. But these same locations make communities vulnerable to flooding when rivers overflow their banks. When storms drive ocean waters inland, or when other hydrological events occur, and over generations of human habitation, virtually every community located near water will experience significant floods, some of which may be devastating enough to destroy settlements and claim many lives, creating traumatic memories that are preserved and retold, gradually acquiring symbolic and moral dimensions as they are incorporated into the broader narrative traditions of the culture. The end of the last ice age, with its dramatic rise in sea levels, undoubtedly affected human populations living in coastal areas. And it is entirely plausible that some flood traditions preserve distorted memories of the progressive inundation of coastal territories as the glaciers melted and the seas rose. But these would be memories of gradual changes occurring over many generations, not sudden catastrophes, and the details would have been thoroughly transformed through countless retellings over the thousands of years since these events occurred. Psychological research on memory has demonstrated that human recollection is not a perfect recording of events, but rather a reconstructive process that is influenced by subsequent experiences, cultural frameworks, and the narrative structures through which memories are organized and expressed. And oral traditions are subject to even more dramatic transformations as stories are passed from generation to generation, with details being added, removed, or altered to serve the narrative purposes of the storytellers, or to conform to changing cultural values and understandings. This does not mean that oral traditions are worthless as historical sources, for they can preserve important information about past events, but it does mean that we must be cautious about interpreting mythological narratives as straightforward historical accounts, recognizing that they have been filtered through layers of cultural interpretation and narrative development. When we find similar story elements in different cultures, such as flood narratives, this may reflect shared human experiences of natural phenomena rather than memory of specific historical events, for floods are common occurrences in river valleys and coastal areas worldwide, and it would be more surprising if cultures did not develop stories about these impactful events than that they do. The specific details of flood stories often reflect the local geography and environmental conditions of the regions where they developed, showing that they are rooted in particular contexts rather than representing universal memories of a single global catastrophe. And when we examine the chronology implied by these stories where it can be determined, we find that they refer to different time periods, again suggesting multiple origins rather than a single shared event. The scholarly study of mythology reveals that stories serve multiple functions in human societies, not just preserving historical memory, but also teaching moral lessons, explaining natural phenomena, providing entertainment, establishing social hierarchies, and defining cultural identity. And the presence of certain narrative elements in myths may reflect these other functions rather than historical accuracy. The flood narrative is particularly powerful as a literary and symbolic device because it represents both destruction and renewal, the washing away of corruption or past mistakes, and the opportunity for a fresh beginning. And this symbolic resonance helps explain why flood stories are common and emotionally powerful, even beyond any historical basis they might have in actual flood events experienced by the communities that tell them. Another line of argument, sometimes advanced in support of Lemuria and similar lost civilizations, points to the existence of ancient structures around the world that supposedly exhibit similarities, suggesting a common origin, perhaps techniques or knowledge spread by survivors from the lost continent. And while the study of ancient architecture and engineering is indeed fascinating, the patterns that emerge from careful analysis do not support the lost continent hypothesis, but rather reveal both the independent ingenuity of human cultures and the genuine historical connections that existed through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Monumental stone architecture has emerged independently in many different cultures around the world because stone offers obvious advantages for creating permanent structures. It is durable, widely available in many regions, and capable of bearing great weight, and humans working with stone naturally discover certain basic principles of construction, such as the stability of pyramidal forms, the usefulness of precisely fitted blocks, and the structural advantages of particular architectural elements, leading to what might appear to be similarities, but that actually represent convergent solutions to common engineering challenges. When we examine ancient structures in detail, we find that while they may share some broad characteristics, they differ significantly in their specific construction techniques, their measurements and proportions, their decorative elements, and their cultural contexts, differences that reflect the unique histories and environments of the societies that built them rather than suggesting a common origin in a lost civilization. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates that the construction techniques used for various ancient monuments developed over time within their respective cultures, with earlier experimental structures showing progressive refinement leading to later achievements, a pattern completely incompatible with the idea that these techniques were inherited wholesale from an advanced lost civilization. The dating of ancient structures through various archaeological methods consistently places their construction within known historical periods for which we have abundant evidence of the cultures that built them, and there are no mysterious gaps where structures appear without antecedents or cultural context. Some proponents of lost continent theories have suggested that certain structures are much older than archaeologists claim, but these alternative datings typically rely on misunderstanding or misapplication of dating techniques, selective citation of evidence, or rejection of the entire framework of archaeological and geological dating without providing a coherent alternative that can account for the full range of evidence. The precision and ambition of ancient engineering achievements like pyramids, massive stone walls, and other monumental constructions certainly inspire awe and raise questions about how people without modern technology accomplished such feats. But archaeological research has provided increasingly detailed answers to these questions, revealing the sophisticated techniques, organizational capabilities, and sheer human effort that went into creating these structures. And while our understanding continues to evolve with new discoveries and research, there is no need to invoke lost civilizations or mysterious transferred knowledge to explain these achievements. Ancient peoples were just as intelligent and creative as modern humans, and given sufficient motivation, social organization, and accumulated practical knowledge, they were capable of remarkable engineering feats using the materials and tools available to them, and the evidence shows that this is precisely what occurred. With each culture developing its own approaches to monumental architecture based on local materials, environmental conditions, and cultural priorities. The genuine connections that did exist between ancient cultures are also fascinating and worthy of study, for trade networks extended across vast distances. Ideas and technologies did spread from one region to another through various forms of cultural contact, and human migration carried skills and knowledge to new locations. But these historical processes of cultural exchange and diffusion can be documented through archaeological evidence and are quite different from the sudden transmission of advanced knowledge from a lost civilization. Perhaps the most definitive evidence against the existence of Lemuria as a sunken continent comes from the detailed understanding of Earth's geology that has been built up through more than a century of careful research, observation, and analysis of rock formations, mineral deposits, and the structure of the planet's crust and mantle. Every rock tells a story about the conditions under which it formed, the processes it has undergone since its creation, and the broader geological context in which it exists, and geologists have become remarkably skilled at reading these stories, piecing together the history of our planet from the evidence preserved in stone. The rocks that make up continental crust are fundamentally different from those that form oceanic crust, not just in their composition, but in their age, their structure, and their density, and these differences reflect the distinct processes through which each type of crust forms. Continental crust is composed primarily of relatively light rocks rich in silica and aluminum. It is thick, often extending 30 to 50 miles down into the mantle, and it includes rocks of vastly different ages, some dating back billions of years to the early history of Earth, because continental crust is too light to be subducted and destroyed at tectonic plate boundaries, instead being crumpled, folded, and metamorphosed but remaining at the surface throughout its existence. Oceanic crust, by contrast, is composed primarily of basalt, a denser rock that forms when magma erupts at mid-ocean ridges. It is relatively thin, typically only about 4 to 6 miles thick, and it is young in geological terms, with the oldest oceanic crust being less than 200 million years old, because oceanic crust is constantly being created at spreading ridges and destroyed at subduction zones in the ongoing cycle of plate tectonics. This fundamental difference in the nature and behavior of continental and oceanic crust means that continents cannot sink beneath the ocean to become ocean floor, as Lemuria was supposed to have done, because the physical properties of continental crust, particularly its low density, cause it to float high on the mantle, and no known geological process can transform continental crust into the denser oceanic crust or cause it to suddenly sink into the mantle. When geologists study the ocean floor in the regions where Lemuria was hypothesized to have existed, they find exactly what would be expected based on plate tectonic theory: oceanic crust of appropriate age, showing clear evidence of formation at mid-ocean ridges, magnetic stripping patterns that record the reversals of Earth's magnetic field and that confirm the spreading of the ocean floor, and sediment layers whose thickness and composition match what would accumulate over the time period since the underlying crust formed. There are no anomalous areas where continental-type rocks appear in the middle of ocean basins, no mysterious geological features that cannot be explained by conventional plate tectonics, no evidence whatsoever for sunken continents in the locations where theories like Lemuria placed them. The study of seismic waves, vibrations that travel through the Earth generated by earthquakes or artificial sources, has allowed scientists to map the internal structure of the planet with remarkable precision, revealing the boundaries between different layers, the variations in density and composition at different depths, and the structure of the crust beneath both continents and oceans, and these seismic studies confirm the picture developed from surface geology, showing normal oceanic crust in ocean basins with no hidden continental masses lurking beneath. Rock samples brought up from the ocean floor through drilling programs and other sampling techniques consistently show the basaltic composition expected for oceanic crust, along with the overlying sediments that accumulate as material settles from the water column above, and the ages of these rocks and sediments fit perfectly with the predictions of plate tectonic theory regarding when the underlying crust formed and how long sediments have been accumulating. Some underwater plateaus and ridges do show evidence of having once been above sea level, as indicated by the presence of shallow water fossils or erosional features that form in the surf zone, but these features are volcanic in origin, formed at hotspots or along volcanic island chains, and their subsidence below sea level is explained by the cooling and thermal contraction of the oceanic crust on which they sit, not by any mysterious catastrophic sinking. Returning to the biological questions that originally inspired the Lemuria hypothesis, modern biogeography has developed a sophisticated understanding of how species disperse across the planet, how populations become isolated and diverge evolutionarily, and how the patterns we observe today reflect the interplay of ecological processes, evolutionary change, and geological history operating over millions of years. The distribution of lemurs, which started the whole Lemuria discussion, is now understood as a result of ancient connections between landmasses when they were configured differently, followed by millions of years of evolution in isolation after the continents separated, and genetic studies have allowed scientists to determine approximately when different lineages of primates diverged from one another, with the results matching well with what we know about continental movements and the timing of geographical separations. The peculiar fauna found on the large island where lemurs primarily live today represents a mix of ancient lineages that arrived when the island was still connected to or very close to other landmasses, followed by a long period of isolation during which these populations evolved in unique directions, unaffected by competition from groups of animals that came to dominate other continents. And this isolation explains both why some ancient lineages persisted there when they went extinct elsewhere, and why so many species found there exist nowhere else on Earth. Similar patterns of distribution and endemism are found on other islands and isolated landmasses around the world, each with its own unique history of colonization, isolation, and evolutionary radiation, and studying these patterns has revealed general principles about how geography and geology shape the diversity of life. One of the most important insights from modern biogeography is that the distribution of species reflects a complex history rather than a simple snapshot of dispersal from centers of origin, and disentangling this history requires integrating evidence from fossils, from the geographic distributions of living species, from genetic relationships revealed through DNA analysis, from our understanding of past climates and environments, and from geological knowledge about how continents and ocean basins have changed over time. Long-distance dispersal, once thought to be extremely rare and thus unable to account for the presence of related species on widely separated landmasses, has been shown to occur more frequently than previously appreciated, with documented cases of organisms traveling vast distances across ocean barriers through various means including wind currents, ocean currents, rafting on floating vegetation, and transport by birds. While any individual long-distance dispersal event might be highly improbable, when we consider the vast spans of geological time available, millions of years during which countless opportunities for dispersal occur, events that seem virtually impossible on human timescales become not just possible but statistically likely to have occurred multiple times. Island biogeography theory has formalized our understanding of how the size of islands, their distance from mainland sources of colonizing species, and the balance between immigration and extinction determine patterns of species diversity, and this theoretical framework successfully predicts many features of the distributions we observe in nature. The recognition that species ranges are dynamic, expanding and contracting in response to climate change, sea level fluctuations, and other environmental factors, has added another layer to our understanding, showing that the distributions we see today represent only a snapshot of patterns that have changed continuously throughout history. Fossils reveal that many species once occupied much larger ranges than they do today, or that they occurred in locations that seem improbable given current distributions, and rather than indicating sunken continents, these fossil distributions tell us about past environmental conditions, about land connections that existed when geography was different, and about how climate change and other factors have repeatedly reshuffled the biological deck, allowing species to expand into new areas when conditions become favorable, and contracting their ranges or driving them to extinction when environments change adversely. As we contemplate the vast ocean expanses where Lemuria was imagined to exist, it is worth considering what actually lies in these deep waters, for the deep sea is one of the most fascinating and least explored regions of our planet, harboring unique ecosystems and geological features that are wondrous enough without requiring any additions from mythical sunken continents. The deep ocean floor, far from being a barren wasteland as was once believed, teems with life adapted to extreme conditions of pressure, cold, and darkness, and the exploration of these depths has revealed ecosystems unlike anything found in familiar shallow water or terrestrial environments. Hydrothermal vents, discovered only in recent decades, create oases of life in the deep sea, where superheated water rich in dissolved minerals erupts from the ocean floor, supporting communities of bizarre organisms that derive their energy not from sunlight but from chemical processes, with bacteria forming the base of food webs and being supported by the minerals and heat from the vents themselves. And these ecosystems have revolutionized our understanding of the possible bases for life, and have even influenced thinking about where life might exist elsewhere in the solar system. The deep ocean basins are dotted with seamounts, underwater mountains that rise thousands of feet from the abyssal plains, and these features create local changes in ocean currents and chemistry that support distinct biological communities, with many seamounts harboring species found nowhere else. Their isolation on these underwater peaks creating something analogous to oceanic islands, where evolution proceeds in unique directions. Cold seeps, where hydrocarbon-rich fluids leak from sediments, create another type of chemosynthetic ecosystem in the deep sea, supporting communities of organisms adapted to utilizing these chemical energy sources, and the discovery of these various deep-sea ecosystems has expanded our appreciation for the diversity of life and the range of conditions under which organisms can thrive. The sediments that cover much of the deep ocean floor accumulate slowly, layer upon layer of material settling from the water column above, including the microscopic shells of plankton, dust carried by winds from distant continents, volcanic ash from eruptions, and occasionally larger debris that sinks from the surface. And these sediment layers preserve a detailed record of ocean history, including past climate conditions, biological productivity, and major geological events. Scientists extract cores of these sediments, drilling down through layers that may represent millions of years of accumulation, and by analyzing the fossils, chemical composition, and physical properties of the sediment layers, they can reconstruct past ocean temperatures, the timing of ice ages, changes in ocean circulation patterns, and many other aspects of Earth's history. This sediment record, like the rocks of the ocean floor itself, shows no evidence of sunken continents, but rather tells a coherent story of ocean basin evolution through seafloor spreading, of climate changes that affected the biological productivity of surface waters, and of the gradual accumulation of material in an environment that has remained deep ocean throughout the time period represented. The technological challenges of exploring the deep sea are considerable, for the extreme pressures at depth require specially designed equipment, the complete darkness necessitates artificial lighting, and the vast distances involved make comprehensive surveys difficult and expensive. But despite these challenges, oceanographic research has mapped and sampled enough of the deep ocean to confidently state that no large sunken continent lies hidden in these depths. Only the expected features of oceanic crust, volcanic seamounts, sediment plains, and the products of ongoing geological processes. Modern technology, including autonomous underwater vehicles, remotely operated vehicles, sophisticated sonar systems, and deep-sea drilling capabilities, has given us unprecedented access to the ocean depths. And while there are certainly still discoveries to be made and mysteries to be solved regarding deep-sea biology, chemistry, and geology, these will not include finding continents that somehow sank into the abyss. For the fundamental physics and geology of the planet simply do not allow for such transformations. While the specific hypothesis of a sunken Lemuria is incompatible with geological reality, it is worth considering what kinds of catastrophic changes our planet is actually capable of experiencing, for Earth's history is indeed punctuated by dramatic events that have profoundly affected the surface environment and the life that inhabits it. Volcanic eruptions on scales difficult for us to imagine have occurred multiple times throughout geological history, with some events creating vast flood basalt provinces, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles with layer upon layer of lava, flows hundreds or even thousands of feet thick, and these massive volcanic episodes, occurring over periods of hundreds of thousands to millions of years, likely had profound effects on global climate through the release of enormous quantities of volcanic gases into the atmosphere. The impact of large asteroids or comets has repeatedly struck our planet with devastating consequences, with some impacts creating craters hundreds of miles across, vaporizing rock, ejecting material into the atmosphere that circled the globe and darkened the skies, generating earthquakes and tsunamis, and triggering wildfires across entire continents. And at least one such impact is strongly implicated in a mass extinction that eliminated a vast proportion of species, including many dominant groups of animals. These catastrophic events, while real and significant, operate on scales and through mechanisms quite different from the sinking of continents, and they leave clear geological signatures that allow scientists to identify when and where they occurred and to study their effects on the environment and on life. Climate changes throughout Earth's history have also been dramatic, with the planet oscillating between periods of warmth when ice caps were minimal or absent, and polar regions supported temperate forests. And ice ages when vast ice sheets extended far from the poles and global temperatures were significantly cooler than today. And these climate shifts occurred through complex interactions between orbital variations that affected the distribution of solar energy reaching Earth, changes in atmospheric composition, rearrangements of ocean circulation patterns, and feedback mechanisms that amplified or dampened the initial changes. The transitions between climate states could be relatively rapid in geological terms, occurring over periods of decades to centuries, fast enough to significantly affect human societies, but slow enough to allow many species to adapt through migration or evolution, though some species inevitably went extinct when they could not adjust quickly enough to the changing conditions. Sea level changes associated with the growth and melting of ice sheets have been substantial, with levels varying by more than 300 feet between glacial and interglacial periods, and these changes undoubtedly affected coastal populations, flooding low-lying areas during periods of warming and exposing continental shelves during cold periods, but these are gradual processes occurring over thousands of years. Not sudden catastrophes that would sink entire continents in brief apocalyptic events. The geological record shows that Earth's surface is dynamic and constantly changing, but these changes occur through processes that we understand reasonably well, and they operate within constraints imposed by the laws of physics and chemistry. Continental crust does not suddenly sink into the mantle, ocean basins are not created or destroyed in human-relevant timescales, and while catastrophic events do occur, they involve processes like volcanism, impacts, earthquakes, and climate shifts rather than mysterious transformations that leave no geological trace. As our journey through the story of Lemuria draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating what this tale reveals about human nature, about our relationship with the unknown, and about the interplay between scientific inquiry and imaginative speculation. The transformation of Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis proposed to explain biogeographical puzzles into a mystical lost civilization represents a fascinating case study in how ideas evolve, how they can serve different purposes for different audiences, and how the human imagination fills spaces left empty by incomplete knowledge. The original Lemuria hypothesis proposed to explain the distribution of lemurs and related primates across widely separated landmasses was a reasonable speculation given the state of knowledge in the mid-19th century, when the mechanisms of continental drift were unknown, when the nature of the ocean floor was mysterious, and when the full complexity of biogeography had yet to be appreciated. A scientific understanding advanced, as plate tectonics revolutionized geology, as oceanographic research revealed the true nature of the deep sea, and as evolutionary biology and biogeography developed more sophisticated frameworks for understanding species distributions, the need for Lemuria as a scientific explanation disappeared, replaced by a more accurate and ultimately more satisfying understanding of how continents move, how life disperses across barriers, and how the patterns we observe today reflect millions of years of geological and evolutionary history. Yet even as Lemuria faded from scientific discourse, it found new life in more speculative realms, transformed into a mystical land of ancient wisdom and advanced civilization, a story that speaks to deep human desires to believe that we are part of a larger narrative, that others came before us who achieved greatness, and that beneath the surface of conventional history lie deeper mysteries waiting to be discovered. This transformation reflects something important about how humans relate to the unknown, for while scientific explanations based on evidence and testable hypotheses provide one form of understanding, they do not necessarily satisfy all the psychological and emotional needs that drive our curiosity about the past and our place in the cosmos. Stories of lost civilizations, of ancient wisdom, of lands swallowed by catastrophe offer narrative frameworks that feel meaningful in ways that technical discussions of plate tectonics and biogeographical dispersal mechanisms may not, even though the latter are supported by evidence while the former exist primarily in imagination. This does not mean we should abandon scientific rigor in favor of more emotionally satisfying stories, for the pursuit of evidence-based understanding has proven remarkably successful at revealing the true nature of our world, at solving mysteries that once seemed impenetrable, and at expanding human knowledge in ways that have practical benefits, as well as satisfying intellectual curiosity. The real story revealed by geology, oceanography, and biogeography is in many ways more wondrous than the imagined Lemuria, for it tells us that continents actually do move across the face of the planet, that the ocean floor is constantly being created and destroyed, that life has spread across the globe through a combination of ancient connections, when geography was different, and occasional long-distance dispersal events that seem improbable but that become inevitable given enough time. And that the patterns we observe today reflect hundreds of millions of years of dynamic history. The genuine mysteries that remain about our planet's past are plentiful and fascinating. We continue to discover new species in the deep sea and in other unexplored environments. We are still piecing together the details of past climate changes and understanding how they affected life. We are constantly refining our understanding of how evolution works and how continental movements have influenced the development of biodiversity. And these ongoing scientific investigations provide endless opportunities for discovery and for expanding human knowledge. The appeal of mysteries like Lemuria also reminds us of the importance of maintaining intellectual humility, of acknowledging the vast amount that we do not yet know, and of remaining open to new evidence and new interpretations while still applying rigorous standards of evidence when evaluating claims about the past. In contemplating vanished lands and lost civilizations, we are ultimately exploring questions about impermanence, about how even the most seemingly solid and permanent features of our world are subject to change over time, about how knowledge can be lost as well as gained, and about how the past contains stories that challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding of what is possible. The search for Lemuria, whether approached scientifically or imaginatively, reflects the human drive to explore, to question, to seek patterns in complexity, and to construct narratives that give meaning to the fragments of evidence available to us. As we stand at the end of this journey, looking back across the territory we have traversed, from the original biogeographical observations that inspired the Lemuria hypothesis, through the development of plate tectonic theory that provided better explanations for those observations, to the mystical transformation of Lemuria into a lost civilization, and finally to our modern understanding of what actually lies beneath the ocean waves. We can appreciate both the scientific progress that has been made in understanding our planet's history and the persistent human fascination with mysteries, with lost lands, with the possibility that important knowledge remains hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. The ocean floor continues to hold secrets, but they are secrets about hydrothermal vent ecosystems, about the details of seafloor spreading, about past climate changes recorded in sediment layers, about the adaptation of life to extreme conditions, rather than secrets about sunken continents, and these genuine mysteries provide ample scope for wonder, for investigation, for the satisfaction of discovery that comes from carefully studying the evidence and piecing together the true story of our planet's dynamic past. In the end, the legend of Lemuria serves as a reminder that while our imagination can construct elaborate stories about the past, the real history revealed through scientific investigation is richer, more complex, and ultimately more trustworthy than speculation unsupported by evidence, and that the pursuit of truth through careful observation, rigorous analysis, and willingness to revise our understanding when new evidence appears remains our most reliable path to genuine knowledge about the world we inhabit and about the deep history that has shaped it. As we conclude this exploration, we recognize that while continents do not sink beneath the waves as Lemuria was supposed to have done, our planet remains a place of wonder, a world where continents slowly drift across the surface, where life has evolved and dispersed in patterns that reflect millions of years of changing geography and climate, where the ocean depths harbor unique ecosystems and geological features that continue to surprise and fascinate us, and where genuine mysteries remain to be solved through the patient application of scientific methods, mysteries that do not require us to invoke lost civilizations or vanished continents, but that are nonetheless capable of inspiring the same sense of awe and curiosity that stories like Lemuria have long generated in the human imagination.